Here's a quick video about white balance with some examples. If you have a medium gray object, like a gray card, that is a defined level of brightness. It's a defined level of printing. If you go to your color picker and you go halfway between white and black, in an RGB image, the brightest something can be, which is pure white, is 255. The darkest something can be is 0. When you mix equal amounts of red, green, and blue, you get a neutral tone, or medium gray. So here I have filled the screen with medium gray. If I printed that out and took an actual picture of it, I know the exact definition of it. It should be exposed at level 128. When you open an image, if you will look at your info palette, I can take the eyedropper tool, and when I place it anywhere on the gray patch, you'll see right over here, it displays my red, green, and blue image data. So I'm at 127, 128, 128. That is the file's exact value. So if I take a picture of it, I'm trying to properly expose it. It should come out at that value. And because something medium gray is equal amounts of red, green, and blue, my numbers for red, green, and blue should be equal, give or take a point. If I were to put a warming filter on this medium gray, the same as if we shot the picture in some warm light, it's going to add some warmth to the gray. To our eyes, this gray patch now looks slightly warm, slightly orangish, and if I look over here at my numbers, you'll see after the slash, it started out at 127, 128, 128, or essentially equal numbers of red, green, and blue. After I put the filter on it, the red channel is at 133, the green channel is at 126, and the blue channel is at 121. So, looking at the numbers, I can see there's extra red and green in the image compared to blue. In addition to looking at your pixels as number values in the RGB channels, you can look at your histogram. And your histogram is just a graph of where your numbers are coming out. So, there's a red channel, there is a green channel, there is a blue channel. With this filter on the gray, when you look up here at the combined histogram, you can see that red is ahead of green and blue, green is in between red and blue is the furthest to the left. That tells you that there's red, the red channel is slightly overexposed compared to green and blue, and that green is exposed slightly off compared to red and blue, and that blue has the least exposure value. So not only can we look at the gray color and see it's slightly orange, we can look at the numbers and see that it's slightly orange, and we can look at the histogram and see that it is slightly orange. When you white balance an image, all you're doing is neutralizing gray back to a neutral value. So if I open the camera raw filter and I take the eyedropper tool, when I hover it over here, up here in the value section, I can see my numbers. Now I've already clicked and it neutralized it to make everything 140, 140, 141. So it's off by 1 point. You can see it adjusted my temperature and my tint. If I want to bring that back to about 128, which is where it should be, I can just reduce the exposure. And now you see when I hover, the numbers pop up over here. I'm at 129, 130, 130, so within a point or two of perfect middle exposure. The exposure slider changes ever so slightly. There we go. So I'm now at 127, 127, 127. because I neutralized gray. That means when I look at my numbers on the info palette, they are all equal to each other. And if I were to view the histogram, now each of the three spikes is sitting one on top of the other, and I don't have the disbursement. In a real world situation, this was an image taken by somebody in the group and posted, and what they were commenting on is if I use the white balance tool on the white section of the card, I get kind of one white balance change, and when I use it on the gray section, it is slightly different. Now, there could be a couple different reasons for that. One could be is that one of these two cards is slightly out of calibration. The other could be is sometimes if the light has a color cast that is primarily in the highlights, you get a better or more effective white balance correction if you use the white card. If your color cast is more of a mid-tone color cast, sometimes you get a better white balance correction by using the gray card. There's a third way where you can correct the gray card to correct your mid-tone values, and then you check your white card to see if it's still out of kilter, and if it is, you can make a curves or levels adjustment. I will show you that now. For starters, if you have the eyedropper tool selected and you hold down the Alt button, the Shift button, and I click, I can put markers 1 and 2 on the cards. So marker 1 shows that my white value is 205, 194, 179. If that was true pure white, all three numbers for white should be 205. They are not. If you look at the gray card, it's actually sitting at 105, 105, 105. So the gray card in this shot is actually neutral. Now it's slightly underexposed because that number should be 128 in each of the three channels. So again, if I go to the camera raw filter, or you can do this in Lightroom, and I click on the gray card, we see no real change because gray is already neutral. But if I come up here to white and we look at our numbers that pop up over here, red's 210, green is 201, blue is 185, there are 25 more points of red reflecting off this white card, and there are 10 more points of red bouncing off than green. But if I click it with the eyedropper tool, now you'll see when the numbers pop up, it's neutralized that to 206, 206, 205. Fantastic. I now have neutralized white. I have good white balance off of white. But what happens if I slide back down to gray? My gray is now out of kilter. It's red 110, 121. So sometimes using the eyedropper tool on the gray doesn't give us perfect exposure in the highlights, and sometimes clicking on white fixes our problem in the highlights but not on gray, and you'll have to do some sorting to try to figure out why that is. The simple way I like to do it is I traditionally use the card that is gray and white and black. I come over, I take the eyedropper tool, and I neutralize gray and tell it OK. At that point, I know my midtones are white balance corrected. And if I look over here on marker number 2, which is the one on screen, I'm at 105 in all three of the channels, which means gray is neutral. But when I come up to white, over here, marker number 1, I'm at 205, 194, 179. The way to then try to color correct the highlights while leaving the gray is intact, I can go to curves, let me get it off of my, and we're going to pay attention over here. Red's at 205, we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to come to the green channel. We're going to lock down the midtones by placing a point, and I can increase the green value in the highlights till it hits 205. So now, I went a little too far. So now my red is at 205, my green is at 205, I'm going to come to the blue channel, lock down the midtones with a point, and I need to increase blue. So now red, green, and blue on the white one is at 205, 205, 205. So the white is corrected. And sometimes that, you see how it slightly shifted the green and blue? You can come back here to your midtones. You know, if you're being super precise, try to get it to 105. And go back to the green channel. It says green is at 109 and I want it at 105 on the gray. And my mouse is super sensitive, so I'm having trouble doing this. Alright, so at this point, my gray card is reading 105, 105 for gray, and 205, 205, 205 for white. I now have correct white balance, not only on the gray card, but also on the white card. If I were to flatten that image, or apply that curves adjustment layer, I now have corrected the white balance as best I know how. We have one slight other problem. It's slightly underexposed. I could reopen Camera Raw and turn the brightness up, but one thing you can do, if you're familiar with the histogram, you see this tall spike right here? That's my spike for middle gray, and it's slightly to the left because my numbers are 105. If I just take the center slider, which is where 128 is, and I slide it right under that middle spike, you'll notice my gray card is now at 128, which represents good exposure, and my white is at 215, which is bright but not overexposed. So now I have corrected white balance both in the midtones and in the highlights. That's as good as you can do it. If I go to the histogram, you see all this data. And all this data is represented because there's all these different tones in the image. But if I draw a square selection on the white, you'll notice all my spikes line up perfectly. And if I draw a selection on the gray, I guess I have to deselect it on. And for gray, I'm at 127.88. That's both perfect exposure and perfect white balance. It's all fundamentally related to red, green, and blue images. The pixels can be between 0 and 255, and we know the definition of middle gray should come out at 128 if we've exposed it properly. So if I get one of the channels to 128, but the other two channels are slightly above or below 128, I end up with an image that has a white balance problem. The same as if I come back and I put, if I put a photo filter that's too blue, for example, put a cooling filter on here. Now when I look at my information for gray, under number 2, see how the difference, that blue cooling filter added extra blue and took a little red out of the gray card, and it added extra blue and took some red out of the white card, so now my white balance is off. By getting rid of that cooling filter, all my numbers match, which means I'm properly white balanced.